now we'll be looking at the world's most militarised zone, Kashmir. As tensions flare up once again between protesters and the Indian security services, levels not seen in over 6 years. This after the killing of 22-year-old rebel leader Burhan Wani. We explore the Kashmir Question with its constant cycle of funerals and demonstrations over the last 70 years.
Kashmir, the complex game of chess played out by 3 world nuclear powers. It's a game where there are no rules. It's once again erupted with clashes over the last week or so, which has led to the deaths of dozens of civilians and at least 1 officer. The protests sparked after Indian troops killed the popular Burhan Wani, the young leader of Kashmir's largest indigenous rebel group, Hizbul Mujahideen, fighting against Indian rule in the Himalayan region. The death of the 22-year-old caused major upheaval in the region. During his funeral, thousands poured out to pay their respects at his death. Defying curfews and confronting parliamentary troops and riot police on patrol, crowds of youths threw stones at law enforcement officers and rallied in the main city of Srinagar and dozens of other places around the region. To some observers, this is nothing new. People have protested and participated in funeral marches of rebel fighters for years, the largest being that of Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front commander Ashfaq Majid Wani in 1990. A more recent event was in 2010, during a tragic summer of killing, where over 100 unarmed Kashmiri youth were shot dead by the Indian state. The stone-pelting protests began when a boy playing cricket was killed by the security forces as they used excessive force against a demonstration. The Indian state has a force of nearly 700,000 troops, making Kashmir the world's most militarised zone. Sadly, every time people gather in any significant protest against Indian rule, people are killed by security forces. And every time there is a funeral of those who died in those demonstrations, demonstrations follow, and so forth. What has happened in Kashmir recently is only an example of the vicious cycle that repeats itself. Frustration has been steadily building among a generation that has lived almost its entire life under militancy and militarization. There is little space left in Kashmir for most people to express their political aspirations. Over the years, protests have been quelled with an iron hand, and the arbitrary use of the Public Safety Act to book young people has become the norm. The reaction of security forces has only worsened the situation, with their disproportionate use of force in 2008, 2009 and 2010, and now again this year. The Jammu and Kashmir police are increasingly seen as the aggressors. Pakistani Foreign Secretary Aziz Ahmed Chaudhry expressed concern over the killings of Wani and civilian protesters, telling the Indian High Commissioner that the use of force against peaceful protesters was a human rights violation and that the killings should be investigated. Security experts say India's forces, including the army, parliamentary soldiers and border guards, are not equipped to handle civilian uprisings. Most are trained to fight a foreign enemy. The police do not move much confidence either in Kashmir or anywhere else in India. The force is run on the basis of a 115-year-old colonial law and has seen almost no reform since. Last week's uprising again showed that without a robust political solution and the continued viewing of tensions as a matter of law and order by India, the dispute in Kashmir will continue to aggravate. Khadija, Ahmed, Asia Wired.
Now, joining me to discuss the situation in Kashmir is Kashmiri writer Dr. Natasha Hole, who is Assistant Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster in London. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kaul. Firstly, it's the worst level of violence not seen in 6 years. What's behind the latest flare-up?
Well, you see, this violence continues every now and again. So whatever periods of non-extreme violence that we have are just uneasy periods of calm. It doesn't mean that the underlying issues have gone away. In terms of what's behind the current flare-up of violence, as you call it. It was the death or the killing by the Indian security forces of a Kashmiri rebel leader whom the Indian forces call a terrorist, and they killed him and his associates. And by their own admission, he was not directly involved in any operations, but he was in terms of the media language seen as a poster boy for Kashmiri militancy. However, he was very popular in Kashmir because the cause that he stood for was a cause of Kashmiri self-determination, which is something that has mass popular appeal in Kashmir. And his death, the funeral processions, the demonstrations and the funerals after his death were shot. The Indian security forces used excessive force, shot people, and obviously that has a reaction. So in Kashmir, as I say, every funeral is a demonstration, and every demonstration is a funeral.
But now that Wani, is dead, is he more dangerous now to India? Your thoughts?
Well, Burhan Wani is a symptom. He symbolized a sentiment in Kashmir. He's not. The Indians like to project it as this being the cause of the violence. This is of the Kashmir problem, the terrorism. But actually, this is just a symptom of the underlying issues. Whether he's more dangerous, well, Kashmiris say you may have killed one Burhan Wani, but thousands more will rise up. So in that sense, it's beyond understanding how the state thinks that simply by killing people that it can achieve any kind of resolution to Kashmir without accounting for the aspirations of the Kashmiri people. There's a complete level of denial in India and a neglect by the world of what actually is going on in Kashmir, which is the fact that the Kashmiri people are not only denied their human rights, but they're also denied their right to self-determination.
So could you go more into in terms of the deeper rooted issues? When did this all begin? Just for the benefit of our viewers, when did it all begin, and why has it been taking so long to find a political solution?
Well, you see, very, very often the international media cynically refers to Kashmir as one of the hardy perennials of South Asia. I've heard this in person. They just think of it as a problem that doesn't go away. The problem is not the Kashmiri people refusing to somehow be peaceful. The problem actually has its roots going back in time. And whereas many commentators in India simply trace the roots back to the late 80s or early 90s and say, well, it was an Islamist insurgency, in order to really understand Kashmir, you have to go much further back, and history can take us back to the 19th century. I mean, Kashmir was not seen as a peopled place. It was bought and sold by the British to a ruler who wasn't representative, and therefore at the time of the partition of the subcontinent and the independence of those countries of India and Pakistan from the British Empire, at the time that these countries were created, Kashmir was bracketed into parts of Kashmir were bracketed into both these nations without accounting for the aspirations of Kashmiri people, because it was attacked from one side. And from the other side, it was promised, but it was helped. But in return, it was promised things that were never delivered to the people, because it was a pact or an agreement between an unrepresentative ruler and the surrounding countries. So you can go back in history and think of why, for example, there is the Article 370 in the Indian Constitution. Why? So when people say Kashmir is the same as any other state in India, that's factually incorrect, because it is not. Kashmir has had, even within Article 370, the autonomy that gave Jammu and Kashmir has been gradually eroded over time, and to the extent that and of course and there's been all the interference in the elections, and from the 80s onwards, there were movements both from within Kashmir and from outside Kashmir, so from cross border from Pakistan. But in essence, what that has meant is that all kinds of Kashmiris, Kashmiri Muslims, Kashmiri Hindus, all the other people living in Kashmir have suffered over time, and especially since the early especially since the 90s, there have been these emergency powers in Kashmir, such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which in effect gives immunity to armed forces for any killings in Kashmir, for anything they do, because they are not brought into account in any kind of court, where they actually can be held accountable. So what this has meant is that even by conservative estimates, over 60,000 people at the least have been killed. 8 to 10,000 have been the victim of enforced disappearances. There have been mass rapes. There are well-documented instances of torture. An entire generation of Kashmiris has grown up in that environment, which is marked by being the world's most militarized zone, because nearly 700,000 Indian troops are stationed in Kashmir. So it is held by force. Kashmiris are denied their aspirations, their very basic freedoms. And the Indian rhetoric is, well, if we give them jobs, or it's about economic development. It's not, as we know from Scotland and other places. People's political rights are not.
Dr. Kaul, we're just running out of time, so I'm just going to pose one last question. Of course, Kashmir is located in a region controlled by, each three nations claiming each territory: China, India, and Pakistan. Just a last question: how do you think the question of Kashmir will be solved, in your opinion?
Well, it's really a very simple question were people to accept the reality on the ground. It is only made an intractable dispute because the states around it, in this case I'm talking of India because of the current flare-up, they are, what they want to do is legislate memory and use power in a colonial way. In order to resolve it, all it needs is dialogue of all the sides involved, and most importantly of the Kashmiri people themselves, who are not engaged with it. So the Kashmiri separatist leaders who do not take part, separatist leaders or the Harriet leaders, do not take part in the elections. They are popular, and the leaders who do take part in the elections are seen as collaborators of the government in India at the center. So what it needs is a dialogue and an understanding. But in effect, what we are seeing in India is a hardening of the stance, is a refusal even to act, is an attempt even to make people not see the fact that there is a line of control. Because earlier, there was a bill in the Indian Parliament earlier this year, which seeks to make even the depiction of the line of control a crime punishable in India by the idea is by $15 million and 7 years in jail. So it's unsurprising that by the regurgitation of the same narrative in the Indian media, that this is about it's about terrorism, it's a Muslim problem. It's not a communal issue. It's an issue of the right of a state which happens to be Muslim majority, but it's an issue that they want to exert their right to have their freedom to choose to have a representative government. Because even though India claims that it is a democracy, in Kashmir there is it's not a democracy. There is no democracy in Kashmir because people don't have any democratic rights with any kind of certainty. All their rights, they live in emergency powers with militarization, and all their rights are taken away at the slightest, without the slightest notice.
Dr. Kaul, unfortunately, we've come to the end of this segment. But thank you for joining us. But that brings us to the end of this week's edition of Asia Wide. Join us next week. We'll be connecting you again to the issues facing the world's largest Muslim community. Until then, join the conversation online and share your thoughts at Islam Channel CA using the hashtag AsiaWide, or email us at the address below. Have a great week and see you in the next edition.